Thank you very much, and I now acknowledge the Honourable Member for St. John City West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I stand to present the motion standing in my name dealing with the Cricket World Cup spending. And Madam Speaker, if I may be allowed to read the contents of this motion, which is in the form of a resolution. It reads as follows. Whereas transparency, accountability, and the maintenance of good ethical standards are prerequisites to good governance, and whereas the UPP's campaign pledge to the nation to right all the wrongs and to promote and maintain transparent and accountable governance, recognizing that a lack of transparency and accountability would result in entrenched corruption in the public sector, contrary to the ethical standards expected of a truly transparent and accountable government, and would give rise to socio-economic and political corruption, including widespread discrimination, poverty, distortion of competition, institutionalized nepotism, corrupt public contracting, and organized special interests, extortion of state resources. And whereas corruption is a function of weak government, and that corruption increases poverty levels in absolute terms, has a negative impact on investments, trade, economic growth, human development, safety, and security. And whereas the UPP government's refusal to make available public information, including the bill of quantities, copies of the contracts awarded, and information on the scope of works during Cricket World Cup 2007, as well as a detailed accounting of the $12 million that was transferred to the Local Organizing Committee, the LOC, in contravention of the Freedom of Information Act. Whereas there has been a national call for transparency and full accountability in government spending associated with the infrastructural and ancillary works at Sir Vivian Richards Stadium leading up to Cricket World Cup CWC 2007. And whereas there have been conflicting reports covering the EC $126 million in government spending at Sir Vivian Richards Stadium from various government ministries and agencies, including a reported $68.5 million paid to C.O. Williams for approximately 6 miles of roads, and $13 million to Hortico Landscaping for the preparation of the outfield and landscaping, among other payments in which there was not corresponding value for money. And whereas this lack of accountability and corresponding lack of value for money in the Cricket World Cup spending is indicative of bad governance and have resulted in the erosion in the integrity of the coordinator of the Intergovernmental Working Group, Ambassador David Shaw, and the loss of public confidence in the UPP government as demonstrated in their failure to institute a commission of inquiry into the CWC spending and to institute a proper ethical governance framework. And whereas the entire citizenry has an obligation to actively promote good governance, any potential inaction of the Parliament, government, and other democratic institutions in actively combating bad governance could be construed as aiding and abetting corruption. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House that this resolution be construed not as a tool of reprisal, but as a social, just, and principled bipartisan cause in the fight for good governance, in protection against the abuse of state resources, and the promotion of transparent and accountable governance in the interests of all Antiguans and Barbudans, especially the poor and vulnerable. That a commission of inquiry be held into the spending associated with the roads, other infrastructural and ancillary works at Sir Vivian Richards Stadium leading up to CWC 2007 in the interests of transparency, accountability, and good governance in general.
They took you off of ABS.
That Sir David Shaw be relieved of his position as ambassador pending the outcome of the commission of inquiry. Be it further resolved that the UPP government in the future ensures openness in all of its dealings, including fiscal transparency in the future, open and equitable distribution of government's procurement contracts to avert distortion of competition and wastage, and the full operationalization of the Freedom of Information Act to facilitate public scrutiny and access to information. Now, Madam Speaker.
Excuse me, they took you off of ABS radio.
Okay.
You said so.
Madam Speaker, this resolution is not a personal attack on any citizen. Obviously, certain names will have to be utilized in order to elucidate various points. But you'll see that this resolution, in essence, is calling for good governance, for the establishment of a good governance framework within the public sector. And, Madam Speaker, I'm sure you'd agree that in order to effectively manage state resources, a good governance framework is required. In fact, they're not mutually exclusive. They are integrated in order to ensure that you get good value for money, which is one of the requirements of every government, any government. Then obviously there needs to be a good governance framework in place. And you recognize that this resolution is calling for such a framework. It also deals with a very vexing issue, Madam Speaker, and that is the malspending at the cricket stadium. You recall, Madam Speaker, that back in 2005, July, a number of questions were put to the then Minister of Sports, the member for Rural North, the Honourable John McGinley, requesting information on the government's readiness for Cricket World Cup 2007. Madam Speaker, this took place almost 2 years before the event actually took place. And at that time, the member for Rural North indicated to the nation that it would have cost the country in the region of $130 million to host Cricket World Cup, which included almost $60 million for the construction of the stadium, which would have been and was a grant from the government and people of China. It meant, therefore, Madam Speaker, that the additional works, all of the other preparations, including road construction, preparation of the outfield, those costs were estimated at just over $70 million. 2 years later, Madam Speaker, additional questions were put to certain members, certain ministers of government, and we got certain information that were indeed conflicting and which were certainly cause for alarm. For instance, Madam Speaker, when the member for St. Philip's South was asked to respond as to the mileage, how many miles of roads are constructed at the stadium and at what cost, he said to this Honourable House that about 6 miles of roads are constructed at a cost of $2.37 million, Madam Speaker. In fact, he went as far as stating that they were state-of-the-art roads. During that session, Madam Speaker, we also asked the Minister of Finance, the member for St. John's Rural East, to give an account of the spending leading up to Cricket World Cup. And we got a schedule of payments, Madam Speaker, which I'm prepared to recirculate just in case it's not in the records of the Parliament. And in this schedule, he indicated that a total of $233,000 were actually spent on the roadworks and the ancillary works to prepare for Cricket World Cup 2007.